When I was a child, my family had a cherished tradition of escaping to our secluded cabin in the heart of the Colorado mountains every winter. Tucked away in a dense forest, it was our private sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the world melted away, replaced by the serene crunch of snow beneath our boots and the gentle rustle of wind through the evergreens. My parents were passionate skiers, spending countless hours carving through the powdery slopes nearby. My older brother Evan and I, however, found our joy in the snowy wilderness, building forts, engaging in epic snowball battles, and exploring the endless expanse of pine trees. One winter, during a particularly fierce blizzard, Evan and I decided to brave the storm for a new game. The rules were simple. We'd each build a fort on opposite sides of the woods, hide a snowball as our treasure, and attempt to steal the others while dodging a barrage of snowballs. Evan, always the more daring of the two, chose to set up his base near the edge of a neighboring property, a place that had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. The old house stood ominously at the forest's edge, its dark windows like vacant eyes staring out into the void. There was something unsettling about it, an eerie stillness, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Evan, of course, thought it was the perfect backdrop for our game. I crouched in my fort, waiting for Evan's signal to begin, a sharp whistle that would set the game in motion. The snow fell in thick, swirling sheets, muffling all sound. Minutes ticked by, then 10. Still, no whistle came. "Evan!" I called out, my voice swallowed by the howling wind. No response. A knot of unease tightened in my chest. Reluctantly, I left the safety of my fort and began trudging through the snow, opting for the road instead of cutting through the woods. The snow clung to my boots and the icy wind stung my cheeks. Every few steps, I paused to listen, but the only sound was the relentless howl of the storm. When I finally reached Evan's fort, it was intact but eerily empty. "Evan!" I called again, louder this time. My voice echoed through the trees. Nothing. As I scanned the area, movement caught my eye. An older woman stood on the porch of the neighboring house, bundled in a heavy coat, her face partially obscured by a scarf. She waved at me, her smile warm but somehow unsettling. "Looking for someone, dear?" she called out over the wind. I hesitated. Her tone was kind, but something about her smile felt off, forced. "Yes," I replied cautiously. "Have you seen my brother?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she gestured toward the house. "I think he came by. Why don't you come inside and warm up while we look for him?" Before I could respond, a shadow shifted in the upstairs window. A figure stood there, partially hidden, their face obscured by a hat. My stomach churned. I stepped back instinctively, my eyes darting to the snow. Fresh footprints leading to the porch caught my attention and filled me with dread. They didn't just stop at the door. The tracks doubled back, disappearing into the woods. "Evan?" I called again, panic creeping into my voice. The woman's smile faltered, her expression shifting to something colder, sharper. Heavy footsteps echoed from inside the house, growing louder as they approached the door. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run. My feet finally obeyed, and I bolted, ignoring the woman's voice calling after me. The snow blurred my vision, and my lungs burned as I ran. Then, faint and distant, I heard it, my dad's whistle, a short, sharp note we always used to find each other in the woods. I followed the sound, pushing through the snow until I saw the warm glow of our cabin's windows. Relief washed over me as I stumbled inside, collapsing in the entryway. "Where were you?" my dad asked, his face a mix of concern and frustration. Before I could answer, Evan appeared. He looked pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Evan, I've been looking everywhere for you," I blurted out. He shook his head. "I was looking for you. I saw her too. She said you were inside the house." We told our parents everything. The woman, the figure in the window, the strange footprints in the snow. My dad's face darkened. Without a word, he grabbed a baseball bat and stormed out into the blizzard. He returned 20 minutes later, shaking snow off his coat. "No one's there," he said gruffly. "Doors are locked, and the house is empty." The next day, my dad called the property owners to let them know someone might be trespassing. They were confused. They hadn't been to the house in months. After that, Evan and I stopped playing near the old property. Even years later, we never set foot near it again. Sometimes, when the snow falls just right, I think about that blizzard and what might have happened if either of us had stepped inside that house. Whatever was waiting in there, I'm grateful we never found out. A few winters ago, my friends and I decided to shake off the monotony of daily life with a ski trip to Vermont. The mountain was massive, its trails sprawling in every direction, offering endless opportunities for adventure. By the second day, we'd built up enough confidence to tackle the Black Diamond runs, reveling in the adrenaline rush and the biting cold that nipped at our faces. Around midday, we took a break at the top of one of the lifts, a small plateau that offered a breathtaking view of the snow-covered landscape below. As we sat catching our breath, two women approached us. They introduced themselves as Abby and Sarah, their laughter ringing out like music in the crisp mountain air. Both were strikingly beautiful, their cheeks flushed from the cold, their ski gear immaculate, almost as if they hadn't been skiing at all. But what struck me most was how out of place they seemed. Their accents didn't match the local Vermont drawl we'd heard all week. They carried no ski poles, and their movements were unnervingly fluid, as though the heavy boots and bulky jackets that made the rest of us clumsy didn't affect them at all. "We're bored of skiing with the old crowd," Abby said, her smile charming but with an edge that made my skin crawl. "Want to try something a little more exciting?" Chris, my oldest friend and the group's natural leader, was immediately intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" "Wolf's Run," Sarah chimed in, her voice low and inviting. The name didn't ring a bell. We'd spent hours studying the trail maps, memorizing routes to avoid getting lost, and Wolf's Run wasn't listed anywhere. "It's not on the map," Sarah said, as if reading my thoughts. "It's a locals-only kind of thing. Best powder on the mountain." Chris was sold. A few of my other friends hesitated but ultimately gave in, lured by the promise of an exclusive experience. I wasn't so sure. Something about the way they spoke, their casual confidence, their two perfect smiles, made my stomach twist. We followed them to a part of the mountain we hadn't explored, far from the main lifts and well-trodden trails. The farther we went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of skiers shouting and lifts clattering faded into an eerie silence. Eventually, the trail ended, replaced by a steep, unmarked incline. Abby and Sarah stopped and motioned for us to remove our skis. "It's just a short hike from here," Abby said, leading the way. Chris and a few others followed eagerly, but I hesitated, falling back with Kyle, one of my more cautious friends. "This doesn't feel right," I muttered under my breath. Kyle nodded, glancing nervously at the dense woods surrounding us. "Yeah, man. Why would this trail not be on the map?" "I don't know," I admitted, my unease growing with every step. When we reached the clearing, it wasn't the untouched paradise Abby and Sarah had promised. The ground was uneven, littered with broken branches and patches of exposed rock. There was no sign of a trail, just an open expanse surrounded by towering pines. "Drink up," Abby said, pulling a flask from her jacket and holding it out with a sly grin. Chris grabbed it first, laughing as he tipped it back. "What is it?" Sarah smirked. "Just a little something to warm you up." One by one, my friends took turns drinking, passing the flask around. When it was my turn, I pretended to take a sip, letting the liquid touch my lips but swallowing nothing. It burned like fire, even in that brief contact, and the faint metallic taste made my stomach churn. Within minutes, Chris staggered, his movements sluggish and uncoordinated. "Whoa," he slurred, blinking rapidly. Another friend, Matt, collapsed to his knees, his head lolling to one side before he crumpled into the snow. "What did you give them?" I demanded, my voice shaking as I stepped back. Abby and Sarah's smiles vanished. Their expressions turned cold, their eyes calculating. "They'll be fine," Sarah said flatly. "You shouldn't have come, though." They began muttering to each other in a language I didn't recognize, frustration clear in their tones. Abby glanced at me, her lips pressing into a thin line. "We should just leave him," she said to Sarah. "No," Sarah snapped. "We need him too." They grabbed our skis and poles, dragging them toward the edge of the clearing. I froze, my heart pounding, unsure whether to fight or flee. Then I saw it, a faint path through the woods, leading away from the clearing. I made my decision. As soon as Abby and Sarah's backs were turned, I bolted. The snow was deep, slowing my steps, but adrenaline fueled me. Behind me, I heard Sarah shout, her voice sharp and furious. "Get him!" I didn't look back. The trees thinned, and I burst onto a narrow road. My relief was short-lived. A dark van idled nearby, its engine rumbling faintly. 4 men stood by its open doors, their faces hard and unfriendly. They spotted me immediately, their eyes narrowing. One of them stepped forward, barking an order in the same strange language Abby and Sarah had spoken. I turned and ran back into the woods, my breath ragged. The sound of footsteps followed, heavy and deliberate. Eventually, the footsteps faded, and I found my way back to the clearing. Chris and the others were still unconscious but breathing. Abby and Sarah were gone, along with the skis. I shook Chris awake, my hands trembling. His eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. "What happened?" he mumbled. "We need to leave," I said, forcing calm into my voice. We stumbled our way down the mountain, carrying Matt between us. When we reached the lodge, I reported everything to the staff and local authorities. They took our statements but didn't seem convinced. Wolf's Run didn't exist, they said, and no one had seen 2 women matching Abby and Sarah's descriptions. We left the next day. The incident haunted me for weeks. The thought of what might have happened, what was waiting in that van, still keeps me awake some nights. Whoever they were, whatever their intentions, one thing is certain. Abby and Sarah weren't just skiers looking for adventure, they were hunters. Last winter, my friends and I decided to visit the frozen lake near our town, a spot we often frequented on weekends. The lake was a hidden gem, nestled at the edge of dense woods, its surface stretching wide and undisturbed. There was something magical about standing on the ice under a moonlit sky, surrounded by the kind of silence only snow can create. That night, the snow fell thick and heavy, muffling the world around us. The air was crisp, our breath fogging up the darkness as we trudged toward the lake. With no wind to bite at our faces, we felt invincible, laughing as we tossed rocks ahead to test the ice's strength. The lake had always felt like ours, a place where the world stopped for a while. But that night, something felt different. Halfway across the ice, my friend Nate stopped abruptly, his eyes fixed on the far edge of the lake. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing toward the tree line. We followed his gaze and saw a shadowy figure moving slowly along the edge of the woods. At first, it was hard to make out. It was hunched over, dragging something behind it. The snow and darkness blurred its outline, and we all assumed the same thing. "Is that a bear?" Lily asked, her voice low. We stood frozen, watching the figure's jerky movements, but as it stepped out from the shadows onto the ice, the shape became clearer. It wasn't a bear. The figure straightened up, revealing a man dressed in a full bear suit, head, paws, everything. The suit was ragged, its fur matted and dark with what might have been mud or something else. "What the hell?" Nate muttered, his voice barely audible over the sound of our breathing. The man was dragging a large black bag, its contents unknown. He stopped at a spot near the middle of the lake and knelt down, pulling a heavy rock from the bag. One by one, he began smashing it against the ice, his movements slow and deliberate. Each strike echoed across the frozen expanse, the sound sharp and jarring. We exchanged terrified glances, our laughter and bravado from earlier forgotten. No one said a word, but the unspoken question hung heavy in the air. What is he doing? Maybe he's dumping trash, Lily whispered, though her tone betrayed her disbelief. Or something worse, Nate added grimly. As we debated whether to turn back or keep watching, the man suddenly stopped and straightened. He'd noticed us. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice loud and angry, bouncing off the frozen lake like a gunshot. The four of us froze. For a moment, no one moved. No one even breathed. Then he started toward us. We ran. I've never run so fast in my life. The ice beneath our feet cracked and groaned with each step, but we didn't care. The fear of slipping and falling was nothing compared to the terror chasing us. I glanced over my shoulder just once and immediately wished I hadn't. The man had removed the bear head, revealing his face. His hair was greasy and clung to his forehead, his expression a twisted mix of anger and madness. He clutched the bear's head in one hand and the heavy rock in the other. "Keep running!" I shouted, my voice breaking. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of the parking lot, gasping for breath as we piled into Nate's car. The silence inside the vehicle was deafening as we sat there, too shaken to speak. "What the hell was that?" Lily finally asked, her voice trembling. "Maybe he was dumping something illegal," Nate said, though he didn't sound convinced. We tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Trash, animal remains, something mundane. But deep down, we all knew the truth. Whatever the man was doing, it wasn't normal, and it wasn't harmless. The sight of him stepping out of that bear suit haunted me for weeks. I kept replaying the scene in my mind. The black bag, the rock, the crack of ice beneath his strikes. The way he'd looked at us, as if we'd interrupted something we were never meant to see. Then, a few weeks later, I saw a missing persons poster on the community bulletin board. It was for a child, a little girl named Emily, last seen near the same woods bordering the lake. The timeline lined up too well. My stomach churned as I stared at the photo of her smiling face. I told my friends, and together we went to the police to report what we'd seen. They took our statement, but they didn't seem convinced. No one called us back. I still think about that night, about the man in the bear suit, the bag, the cracking ice. I've stopped going to frozen lakes, because every time I see one, I wonder what's lying beneath the surface and who put it there.